Hi, my name's Gordon Beaming, and in this video I'm going to chat to you about rethinking your application boundary and using Cloudflare. If you don't know who I am, I'm a father and a husband, a software developer, also a triathlete, as well as a Microsoft MVP. You can imagine with the combination of those 5 things, I get very little sleep. So, for this topic, as I said, we're going to talk about rethinking your application boundary and using Cloudflare. But before we start with that, let's take a look at what your sort of traditional applications used to look like. In the most case, you would have a website of sorts, and that would talk back and forth to a SQL database. It wouldn't be uncommon to see something like this. And for the most part, most applications are built this way. Obviously to various complexities, but that's sort of the overall infrastructure, what it looked like. Then we started doing this whole thing called cloud thinking. And what that basically meant, at least initially, is we'd have our same website, and we'd be talking to SQL Server, except now we'd also be talking to other things, like table storage, maybe some unstructured, some NoSQL table storage for unstructured data, NoSQL databases like Cosmos, and then we sprinkle a little bit of other things on top, like the cognitive services or potentially some application insights to monitor our applications. Then we got this other buzz sentence / word, I don't know how we would call it. It's called born in the cloud. And the sort of idea of that is that you rethink how you build your applications. So we no longer think that, oh, everything needs to be a web app. Instead of things starting off as a web app, we think, okay, well, do we potentially put stuff into containers? Do we look at functions and maybe have stuff as serverless? If we're not using it, does it need to run? We then look at different ways of doing security. So we store stuff inside Azure Key Vault. We look at using Active Directory. We use the managed identities that Azure gives us, for example, to access various resources like the Key Vault. We then start building our virtual networks in Azure. We look at hosting our content on CDNs and look at even potentially using front door. And with all of this, we build on sort of the same application logic that we had, but we think about how we do it differently. So we use a sort of fit for purpose resource for what we're trying to do. And again, our data starts looking very similar. We store it in similar mechanisms, except now we focus more on what is the right way to store different data. And then again, we still carry on using stuff like cognitive services and application insights, just to sprinkle a little bit more amazing stuff on top of our applications. And those are obviously just some examples. There's many more things like queues and machine learning, Azure Search, and obviously, you know, the list of resources is like way too much just to randomly rattle on you. And generally what would happen when you start looking at these different resources, at least what will hopefully happen, is you'll start off with an evaluation process. And what you do is say, okay, well, this service that I'm looking at, say Cosmos DB, this is how much it costs, this is how well it can scale. You do some sort of a POC on it, and you look at the pros and cons of what that can give you. You then maybe look at, like, do you have any existing team skills that will allow you to benefit from that resource? So obviously if you're investigating something like Azure SQL, you mostly have those skills because it's mostly the same as what you'd be using on premises. But if you go and look at Cosmos DB, you may or may not have the skills depending on what sort of APIs you interact with Cosmos DB with. And then you also look at, like, is it a specialized skill? So if you start looking at the machine learning aspect of Azure, yes, that could potentially be a specialized skill, and that's either sort of a pro or con, I guess, depending on how you look at it. And there's obviously the compliance aspect. If it's data, where does that data live? The sort of security around the components that you use. Are you able to tighten up that security? and those kinds of things. And then you potentially come up with well, this specific resource, we approve its usage in these scenarios. So you could say, okay, if we're building internal applications, we're allowed to use it, but we're not allowed to build anything for our clients because it's not sort of fit for purpose. And then overall, it would obviously be signed off or not signed off. So if we look back to the sort of born in the cloud and that whole list of components, we can look at two specific ones which we'll look at replacing today. And that is our CDN and Azure Front Door. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, if we look back there, one of those blocks in the top left hand corner there is cost. Now, if we're looking at these two components, it's very easy to rack up a big bill with this. Obviously, your Cosmos DBs could be quite expensive as well, but there's other ways to look at how you would build around that. So obviously, if the use of Cosmos DB works out too expensive for your application, there's a good chance that Cosmos DB is not the right sort of data storage for you. So in that case, you might want to look at something else like table storage or a regular SQL server or Azure SQL. But like I said, in this case, we're going to look at the CDN aspect using like the Azure CDNs, and then Azure Front Door, which has some of their capabilities on it as well as proxying and other fancy things. So let's introduce Cloudflare. As I mentioned previously, we're going to be comparing this against Azure Front Door. So why would you use Cloudflare? Cloudflare allows you to cache your assets on edge nodes. So although your website is hosted in our demo case, which you'll see, it's hosted in South Africa. Anything that's cached, Cloudflare will be pushing out to their edge nodes on different continents. So that means your customers will be able to access those resources a lot quicker than if they were requesting it off your server. The fact that it's coming from Cloudflare's edge nodes means that there'll be less bandwidth for you on your host server. And again, depending on where you're hosting, bandwidth could be very expensive. And then the fact that your server is being hit less, you can run it on a smaller server. I run my blog, I think, on a B2 VM in Azure, which, if you know or don't know, is a very small virtual machine. But I don't really notice any sort of performance issues. Yes, it is just a blog serving it's dynamic content that's cached, so effectively almost static content. But using Cloudflare as an integrated part of my blog, I'm able to use it effectively, which allows me to host it on a much smaller machine than if I were to have all the traffic going directly at my server. Cloudflare has a lot of APIs, so you are able to integrate directly with Cloudflare using those APIs to tweak different capabilities. And then one of the cool things about using Cloudflare is you're able to obfuscate where the host server is. So if someone does a DNS lookup for your site, for example, they'll see, oh, it's at this IP address, but that IP address will be pointing at Cloudflare, not where your physical server is. There's lots of times like where people would want to potentially try to do malicious things to your server, and the first part of that is generally finding out where it is. So if they had to look up where your server is, they would get an IP address, but that IP address wouldn't be where your server is, so there's less chance of them getting into that box. Obviously there's no chance, because there's always interesting ways to get around a lot of things, but in this case there's less chance. So if we were to just look at sort of Cloudflare, there's lots of things you can do with no code changes. As I mentioned, the obfuscated host server. So that's basically just clicking a button that says, well, proxy the traffic through Cloudflare, and by doing so, you will automatically be hiding your host server. And then you get end-to-end encryption. Most sites these days, or at least a lot of new sites these days, all implement their sort of hosting securely. So it's not really that much of a big thing, but the nice thing about the way Cloudflare does it is they give you an origin cert. So although I am hosted physically in South Africa, and Cloudflare is got edge nodes and services around the world. They give me an origin cert, so their servers talk to my server across HTTPS. So that connection itself is encrypted, so I'm not leaving a unencrypted endpoint in Azure for them to talk to. It gets a fully encrypted connection, and the cert that I host with on the Azure side is a sort of a self-signed Cloudflare cert, but Cloudflare servers trust that cert. Now obviously if a normal customer were to browse there directly at the Azure site, they'll get given a message that says, hey, this cert's dodge, and I'll show you now what that looks like when we go into the portal. I mentioned earlier as well, Cloudflare has an API which allows you to integrate with and do amazing things, which we'll see as well as part of our demo. So enough slides, let's roll the demo and see how we could save all those ZARs or dollars or euros. Okay, so our demo app is nothing that complicated. It's a small app that basically is just going to allow us to illustrate the concepts that we're trying to show you. So if we go and refresh this page, you can see that the counter goes up and that the date jumps each time we refresh it, right? So very simple. That's how it works. You can see also each time it takes a little bit of time because obviously it's hitting a very small server and things just take a while with requests. I am also at the moment in a different country, sort of. So you can see from the code, there's nothing super complicated here. There's some HTML elements. When the page gets hit, we obviously increment those counters. We are using GitHub Actions to deploy to Azure. You can see there we're triggering off the master branch, running off Ubuntu agent, and at the end, once it creates the package, we then deploy that into our Azure web app. If we take a look at that Azure web app, you'll see that the only thing that we've really gone and done here is under domains, we've found a custom domain called Cloudflare integration.dada.xyz, and then we've also gone and specified the certificate for that. So if you look here, you can see that the certificate we're using is a Cloudflare origin certificate. And if we go into Cloudflare, you can see that we have configured DNS here, a CNAME for Cloudflare integration over there to demo-cloudflareintegration.azurewebsites.net, and at the moment the proxy status is proxied. Okay, so if we just grab that domain, we head into a Windows console quickly. And we're basically just going to ping this domain. So we're going to ping it just to see what the IP address shows at, and you can see there it's 172.64.88. And then if we ping the demo.cloudflare site, you can see that that's 102.133, and you can see from the sort of domain that's showing there that is sitting in Joburg at the moment. When I mentioned that I was in another country, the sort of reason for that was that I'm using NordVPN at the moment, and I'm actually coming to the site from Canada. So if I switch quickly to the USA, and I jump back here and do another ping, you'll see there that the IP address changed from that 172, it changed to a 104 IP address. So if we go back into Cloudflare again quickly, we're just going to change that proxy status to say, well, it must only do DNS. Now that that's saved, we're going to switch again back to Canada. And the only reason we switch the whole time is because that flushes our DNS nicely for us as well. So you can see here now when I ping Cloudflare integration, it's going straight to that same IP address that's sitting in Joburg. And then if we switch back to the USA and ping it again, you can see again it's that same IP address. So in this case, the IP address didn't change like it did before. So we'll just go quickly and revert this back to proxied, because obviously all the stuff that we're showing here is going to rely on the fact that that is proxied through. If we just take a quick look at what the sort of analytics looks like that you can get with Cloudflare, I'll go ahead and just show you my domain for my blog. We take just a quick look through what those analytics look like and show you the kind of savings that you can get, obviously depending on how you've built your site. So if we look at my request, at the moment there's just over 4 million total requests to my server in the last month, and only 314,000 of those actually made it to the server. And if you look at bandwidth, there's 150 gigs worth of total bandwidth, but only 8.5 gigs of that went to my actual server itself. Then Cloudflare gives you some sort of data that you would normally put in App Insights or Google Analytics, so it just tells you sort of where your traffic's coming from. But looking like just at that bandwidth data, I mean, you know how expensive some bandwidth can be depending on what host you're with. So I mean, a difference of 142 gigs is insane. Part of Cloudflare's offering is they do some sort of protection for you as well. So there you can see threats by country. So that's basically like if they see a request coming through as being malicious, they will do some sort of a challenge, and obviously if it's a bot, the bot will generally fail that challenge, whereas a human would be able to pass it. And then obviously you can see there the sort of different types of threats and sort of how much connections are using what protocol. And then lastly, like if you look at the content breakdown, it shows you sort of what MIME types of your different, or how much of each MIME type you sort of have, and then obviously how much bandwidth you're saving and whatnot. Okay, so there was actually something else I wanted to show quickly in the app. So if we just go back here quickly, as you refresh it, like I said, there was the counter does go up. So I want to show a little API load tester tool. We're not obviously going to add a lot of load, but we're just going to simulate that if we do run a bunch of requests against the server, that the server will in fact go up by the amount as expected. So we head back, now a bunch of traffic hit and it went up. The code itself is not very thread safe, so the numbers won't exactly go as we would expect, but yeah. Cool, so now I want to show the sort of cache everything that you get in Cloudflare. So what we're going to go and do is we're going to create a page rule. And that what we're going to do with that page rule is we're going to say that for our domain, and then any other requests that are underneath that domain, so we use a wildcard of a star there, we want to change the cache level to cache everything. And then we'll save and deploy that. So by default, Cloudflare will cache all your static resources for you. If you want to cache any of your sort of dynamic resources, like your HTML, you need to explicitly say that you want to cache that. If you saw there when we did our little refresh, the counter went up once, but then it stopped going up. And the reason for that is obviously everything's being cached now. So if we go back now after running this little load test again, we'll see that that counter itself hasn't gone up. So we'll give that little refresh. Counter doesn't go up. Just to show you that it's not only on the client side. If we go and disable the client cache, we refresh this, you can see how I'm preserving the log, so you can visually see on the right hand side that we are actually making new requests each time. That number stays on 21, so this is getting cached. What it is, going back to the server again to try and request that content, but obviously in our case that's being served from Cloudflare. Now you can imagine if you sort of publishing new content to your home page and it's sort of being stuck as it was, that could be quite problematic. So Cloudflare has this thing called Purge Everything, or you can do a custom purge where you sort of specify the exact paths and it'll only purge those paths. And you can see the message said it'll take like 30 seconds or up to about 30 seconds. We're just going to hammer the refresh button the whole time until we see the number popping up, so sort of that we got a fresh copy from the origin server. You can see there it popped up, and then we go and refresh it a couple more times and it didn't go up anymore after that. The problem is, in most businesses, not everyone's going to have access to Cloudflare to go and purge that. And you don't always want to purge everything, you want to have a custom purge, so why not put that logic inside the application? So what we're going to do here is we're going to go add a little razor page called refresh. And basically what we're going to do is say that when someone browses to that page, we're going to hit Cloudflare and tell Cloudflare to refresh our cache. So you can see there we've got a method called purge files, and that code block will take in a list of files, build up a request to send to Cloudflare, and then in a similar way that you would hit the button that says custom purge inside Cloudflare UI, this block of code will go and hit the API and perform the exact same functionality for you. The benefit with this is, so like the way I use this for my blog is I publish a new blog post and then I purge the home page, every tag that changes. So you can see here we're busy adding a button that will obviously browse to that refresh page. So that's our way we're going to obviously sort of manually refresh the cache. We just do a little test here quickly and then we'll check that in. And as I was saying, for the blog, what I do is when I click publish on something, I refresh what the home page looks like, I refresh what the tag looks like, as well as any category pages and sort of the RSS feeds. So you're really designing in how you refresh or how you purge that cache based on what pages and assets are affected by changes inside your application. So let's push this to the server and go take a look at our GitHub action that will now be kicked off from this commit and the push, and then we'll see what this looks like. Let's load up the action quickly. You can see there it's already kicked off, the little yellow icon, so we're going to drill into those details quickly. See our build's busy running. Okay, deploying our app, and it's all done. Cool. So let's go and refresh our app inside the browser. So if we click real refresh this time, so obviously it loaded with 1 because that app got recycled with the deployment. But if we click real refresh, you can see that the count's going up each time we do it, and the date itself is also being refreshed. If we just refresh the page normally, that count stays where it is the whole time. And again, if we go and click the real refresh button, that count does go up as we would expect. Okay, so we showed that sort of API load test app earlier. Let's just go hit that app up again. For the hell of it, let's just change the count to be something a bit bigger. Again, it won't make any difference because our app is caching all those requests. Cool. So if we go back here and we refresh, you can see that stayed on 5. Even with all those requests, it's still 5, as we would expect it to be. Okay, so we showed some of the sort of basics that you can do with Cloudflare. Let's look at something a little bit more juicy. So I'm going to go here to the query string, and I'm going to do exp-0, and I'm going to set that equal to test. And you'll see that when this loads, we have a green test site with 375 times count at the moment. You can see every time we refresh, that number does go up, because obviously this site is somehow different. You've seen, and I didn't do any magic editing, but we are still caching this. So what could the reason for this be, that this looks different? We go look in our code. Nowhere does it have anything that's sort of specifically saying look at exp0, like we have no custom middleware or anything loaded. So where could this be? Well, that's our way to introduce something called Cloudflare Workers. So if we go and look at the Workers tab inside Cloudflare, you can see that for this site I have a worker called A/B testing. So if we do a quick edit on that, you can see this is what that code looks like. So when our request is handled, we just have a constant there saying experiment 0. And what we'll do is say that if we see a cookie that says that we're using control, just return the control. Otherwise, if we see one for test, return the test. And what that basically looks like at the bottom is that if it's the control, we just give back the original request. But if it's a test, instead we're going to go and load the request from this other site that lives inside Azure. So you can see we can switch that back to control, and we'll be back on our normal sites again. That when we refresh this, will not have the counter going up. So that's a really neat way if you want to do something like A/B testing. There's a lot more complicated things you can do. I just thought this would be a pretty neat sort of example that we could do to show you some of the power that the Cloudflare Workers can do for you. So I go look at one of the ones that I use. So across a couple of my domains, I use this one called standard headers. And what it does is obviously runs before each request, and I just dump on headers for the different domains. So if it's my blog, I have a certain set of content security policies. If it's the data site, that has some other policies. You can also do things like doing redirects beforehand. So if I take a look quickly at like my wife's domain, so she doesn't have a website, but she does have a Facebook page. So this basically just does a permanent redirect to her Facebook page. So it's saying very simple, and that gets loaded only for her domain. So or her domain in Cloudflare. If we browse to her site, you can see it then redirects straight onto her Facebook page. So that's pretty neat. Again, it's a small example of what you can do. Troy Hunt uses this a lot. I recommend that you go and Google the Troy Hunt and Cloudflare Workers, and you can see some of the amazing stuff he's done with it. Okay, so the last thing we're going to look at is Scrape Shield. So we're going to look at two things. One is protecting your email addresses, and the other one is hotlink protection. So with email address protection, we're basically going to just stop the ability for bots to easily scrape email addresses off your website. And then with hotlink protection, I don't know if you've ever seen when other sites use your, they basically scrape the contents of your website and they host it on their side. And then because they basically just grab the HTML, all the images load from your website, which is not great. They're getting all the sort of traffic for your content, and then because you're hosting the images, you're also paying for the bandwidth for their stuff to run. So if we look at that email address, you saw it look pretty normal. But if we do a view source, you can see that that email address is actually different. So it's got a different sort of code there, and then it loads in a JavaScript file, and that's what's actually decoding that email address and replacing it inline. So it looks normal to the user, which is the whole point. But to bots that are scraping it, they won't be able to sort of easily regex over that. So for the hotlink protection, I'm just going to go to the data test site, grab that HTML, Before we go and paste that in, let's just fire up live server quickly from this directory, and we'll load up that temp HTML file. So you can see it's the nothing here yet HTML, which that matches. And then I'm quickly going to just set the background image to be a direct path onto that Dada site, instead of it being a relative path, because obviously where we're hosting this at the moment we don't have that image. And then we'll just copy that, so you can see that that path obviously does exist. See, this page automatically reloaded, but it doesn't have a background image. Now if we browse that image, the image itself does load. If we open up DevTools and we refresh, you can see that that network call did get blocked, and the reason for that obviously is it doesn't come from our site. So if we go and open that in a new tab, in this case it doesn't have any referrer, that will load perfectly fine. And that's how you protect people from scraping stuff off your site. So obviously, I mean, with the demo and information that I showed today, we've only like scraped the surface of what you can do with Cloudflare. Of the bits I did show, you can do a lot more advanced things, but obviously there's a lot of things that I didn't show that you would be able to have access to. I guess the best part of everything is that for everything that I did show today, that's me using a free account. So that's besides the sort of workers. So the workers, you do get a certain number of requests. That for smaller sites, you'd be able to run the workers for free. But because of the amount of requests going through to my blog, I pay $5 a month, and that allows me across my whole account to run my workers, and I haven't hit the limit of that $5 sort of account for workers. So there's plenty of features that you'd have access to if you do. I think it's called, like, there's a pro account, and then obviously the enterprise account, which lets you do a lot more complicated things for sort of enterprise scenarios that obviously we didn't cover because I'm using a free account. So thank you so much for sticking around and watching how you can rethink your application boundary and use Cloudflare. As usual, if you have any questions, leave them down in the comments, catch me on Twitter, or visit my profile page beaming.dev to see where else I am on the internet. Cheers.